Well, hello everyone, and welcome to World Affairs' fourth program in its Election 2020 series. Up until Election Day, World Affairs is holding a series of virtual conversations on key issues affecting our democracy, like housing, healthcare, disinformation, the role of media, and along with other key global policy challenges such as climate change, the changing U.S. role in the world, and our relations with China, Russia, and countries in the Middle East. We're glad to see you are all eager to learn about some of our most pressing issues at home and abroad. And before casting your vote this November, make sure to continue to listen to our World Affairs broadcasts or podcasts, or in this case, Zoomcasts. Today we'll be discussing the new Silk Road, China's challenge for global leadership. I'm Marcos Kounalakis, moderator for today's program, and I'm a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and the foreign affairs columnist for the Miami Herald and the entire McClatchy news chain. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, MaryKay Magistad. And MaryKay is director of audio journalism at UC Berkeley's graduate. You know what? You no longer are MaryKay, but it was great. You spent a couple of years trying to bring audio journalism to UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. But the thing that you are doing, and it's one of the things that I'm hoping we'll be able to spend a lot of time talking about, is a new podcast, and it's not the one you used to do for the radio program The World, which was called Whose Century Is It? You're now broadcasting, and it's being uploaded on a weekly basis, a new podcast called On China's New Silk Road. And the previous podcast you did, Whose Century Is It?, looked at the ideas, trends, and twists shaping the 21st century, drawing in part on your experience reporting from over 40 countries in over 2 decades, and much of it, of course, based in Beijing, which is why this makes you so expert to look at Asia and at China and this new development. I'm going to just say one more thing about you, MaryKay, and then we can start a discussion. You started in Southeast Asia in 1988, reporting for NPR, The Washington Post, and other media. You opened NPR's first China bureau in 1996 and traveled and reported widely in China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the greater region from 1996 to 1999. You were awarded a Nieman Fellowship and Radcliffe Fellowship at Harvard before returning to China as East Asia correspondent for the BBC Public Radio International program, The World. Those are pretty amazing credentials. We're very lucky to have you, and I'd like to welcome everyone on our Zoom and look forward to our conversation today. So, MaryKay, you are, of course, looking at China and what it is that's going on. And, of course, the question for most of us today is related to why we're all at home on Zoom, and that is the COVID-19 pandemic that the President Trump, put squarely on the shoulders of China and has referred to as, in various permutations, from Kung flu to the Wuhan virus to the China virus. How should we look at the pandemic and China's responsibility and role?
Well, first of all, Marcus, it's a real pleasure to be doing this with you. We go back, we're old friends, and thank you to the World Affairs for hosting this. Look, I covered SARS in China, and they waited 5 or 6 months from when they knew that it was a serious problem in late 2002 to when the government said to the Chinese population as a whole and to the world, yes, we recognize it's a serious problem. By then, the World Health Organization had already 2 months earlier, almost 2 full months earlier, declared it a global emergency. This time there was about a 2 to 3 week delay between when it became pretty clear to local doctors that this pneumonia, this flu, this virus was different from anything else they'd seen, and that it was a really serious problem. For sure, China could have acted more swiftly, should have acted more swiftly. We also have a record here of not having done everything we could have done. And there are a lot of countries in Latin America, including our next door neighbor, Mexico, that are suffering quite a lot right now because we haven't. controlled the virus in the way that we could have. And even though we've shut the border with Mexico to the extent that Mexicans are finding it harder to come into the US, it's not hard for Americans to go there. And, you know, one of the countries that I've focused on in the Belton Road reporting that I've done is Mexico. And there's a certain amount of resentment there about that. So I think, you know, there's a lot of blame to go around. There are a lot of lessons we've learned as we've gotten to know this virus better and have learned what works in slowing the spread. And so as we wait for a vaccine, you know, we all know we should be wearing masks. We all know that social distancing works. I'm not sure how helpful it is at this point to say it's all China's fault. You know, the Chinese government has long had a sort of knee-jerk reflex of, you know, when there's a problem, cover it up until you can't anymore. But this time it actually didn't take that long for them to, you know, snap into gear. And you also have to give them credit for the fact that while it appeared draconian at the time that they were keeping everyone at home and, you know, police were enforcing this, not letting people out, it seems to have worked in terms of slowing, if not stopping, the spread of COVID within China. There are a lot of things you can say about the Chinese government and the authoritarian system, but give them credit when they do something well. And in this particular case, controlling the virus seems to be one of those things.
Well, in fact, clearly they are. This is an auspicious week. We're recording on October 1st, which is, I think, during the Mid-Autumn Festival in China, when those around the country really head to the train stations and airports and travel in great numbers around the country. And if the virus and the pandemic were of significant concern right now, they would be stopping. I have one note here that says that on Thursday of this week, that is October 1st, 13 million Chinese residents traveled on this one day alone. So can you tell me a bit about it? This is also known as Golden Week. Could you put this in context in terms of what it is and why everybody's heading around the country?
Right. Well, so this is actually something that's been encouraged over the course of the last 10, 15 years in China to get, you know, more Chinese out spending money, helping the economy. There's the week around National Day, October 1st. There's also Chinese New Year, when a lot of Chinese go home. And then there's another week in May when, again, people are encouraged to go out and be tourists, visit their families, do whatever they want to do. You know, at this particular point, you know, the Chinese government is quite interested in stimulating the economy, both because of COVID, but also because economic growth has been gradually slowing over the course of recent years. And the government recognizes that one of the things it needs to do is stimulate more consumer demand within China. You know, there's a huge middle class, 200, 300 million people, but particularly with COVID, a lot of people have started saving more money, and the savings rate was already quite high in China. So this is one way that you can get, you know, people out spending a little bit more, and by reassuring everyone that it's safe, that you can travel around. We've licked this thing, we've got it under control. You know, a fair number of people, millions of people, feel comfortable getting on a train or a plane or a bus and going and seeing something else.
Right. In fact, the New Year's festival was really disrupted because COVID really hit at its peak in many ways right at that festival. So it changed those patterns. I'm really curious, you know, it's funny you should talk about the desire to stimulate domestic consumption and consumption in general, get, you know, lower those saving rates and get that economy cranking. There's this one unique day in China, which is coming up next month. It's 11/11. And it's a manufactured holiday as far as I can tell.
So is Valentine's Day.
Yeah,
right?
it seems very similar to, well, at least Valentine's Day, you can sort of make a stretch and say that there's some Saint Valentine who existed at one point. But 11/11, other than these numeric features, I don't think have any kind of mythical or religious significance, or maybe they do.
No mythical or religious significance, but it's about being single, so one. Right.
Oh, I see.
So it's like Singles Day. So go out and do something nice for yourself.
And that's a huge consumer. I mean, isn't that when everyone gets online and sort of orders whatever they can from these websites?
I think it's especially the younger generation, but a lot of people who are most active online in China are under 40. So yes.
Okay, well, look, let's talk about what it is you're doing these days, because it really is remarkable. You've taken a look at this concept, and we'll talk about it a bit, which is the Silk Road, this what's called the Belton Road Initiative in China, BRI it's often referred to as. And it really is the signature policy of the administration in China to go out around the world and start building infrastructure, building networks, establishing in many ways a 21st century Silk Road so that economic and political developments and the power of China can be expressed around the world. But what you've done is taken a real grassroots approach to this, and that is you've headed out into the world, into these areas, both in China but also elsewhere. What's that?
I said, as journalists do.
That's right, and that's right. It's not just grassroots; it's actually shoe leather. It's something that you and I are familiar with doing, but I guess it's noteworthy because it's rare that in the foreign corresponding world these days, where budgets are so tight and media is so focused on doing its reporting online, that reporters and journalists and producers do what you've done, which is really hit the road from Beijing and from Chengdu and Wuhan to Kazakhstan and to Italy and then to Latin America. And you've done this so that you can explain on the ground what the effects are, what the infrastructure is that's being developed. This is your new podcast on China's New Silk Road. Why don't you tell me what it is and why it's important?
Right. So this is a podcast I've been doing with the Global Reporting Center. And, we've been very lucky to get grants from Humanity United and the International Women's Media Foundation and others to put this together. And I've worked with partner reporters in more than a dozen countries around the world in putting together this 9-part podcast. And the reason I got interested in this after 15 years living in China and 25 years covering Asia, but also quite often traveling to other countries in Africa, in other parts of Asia, like South Asia, even a little bit in Latin America, and seeing the impact of Chinese investment over time and seeing how attitudes toward China have changed over time as China has risen in the world and as its economy has gotten stronger. I thought, we hear a lot about, at least I have been hearing a lot about the Belton Road since Xi Jinping announced it in 2013 as his signature initiative. But in fact, what the Belton Road does is it brings together a lot of projects that China had already been doing and a lot of aspirations China had already had. And it bundles them into this extraordinarily ambitious global infrastructure initiative that's really about shifting the center of global trade and global power to China. It's about creating a new architecture of global power. And in doing this, the Chinese government has sometimes pitched it as a $1 trillion initiative. The best estimates at the moment are that the Chinese government has laid out, and Chinese policy banks have laid out about $600 billion roughly, mostly in loans, some grants. A lot of the loans are not, some of them are concessionary, but a lot of them are at pretty high interest rates and with pretty short repayment schedules, which has been an issue for some Belt and Road partner countries. For instance, in Sri Lanka, which has become a country we hear about a lot related to like the downsides of being on the New Silk Road. There had been a port project, an airport project in Hambantota.
Right, and that was not the capital. It was the prime minister's hometown, isn't that
home
right?
district, yes. And it didn't look like it made economic sense at the time that the deal was done. And indeed, hardly anyone used the port or the airport. And the pitch had been, oh, it'll pay for itself, and this is how you'll pay back the loan. But they didn't make money to pay back the loan, and Sri Lanka couldn't pay back the loan. So the Chinese state-owned partner came and said, well, if you look at the fine print in our agreement, and these agreements are often very opaque, even sometimes to the partner signing them, you'll see that, we can get collateral, we can get something other than just your money for this. And what we want is a 99-year lease to this port. and to an area surrounding it, and a fairly large area surrounding it. So that happened in Sri Lanka, and it's sort of reverberated elsewhere on the new Silk Road. In Malaysia, it ended up leading to an election that got rid of one government and put in someone else. In other places, countries have started scaling back what their agreements had been, including Pakistan, which is a close ally of China. Just saying, okay, so we see what happens if you can't pay back your loans. So we want to make sure we're not in that position.
Right. And this is, by the way, just to interject, this is something the Secretary of State Pompeo has referred to as debt trap diplomacy, basically locking in foreign partners and then making them dependent upon on this economic assistance to then extract concessions that might otherwise not have been planned for.
Right. But to be fair, I mean, Sri Lanka kind of stands out as a very specific case. There are probably 8 countries, possibly a couple more, of the dozens that have taken Belton Road projects that are really seriously over leveraged, where they're at risk of being in a similar situation. But the Chinese government also seems to have learned from this particular incident how much it's cost them in terms of goodwill, in terms of trust. And the Chinese government is pretty pragmatic. It learns as it goes. To quote Deng Xiaoping, former Chinese leader, you cross the river by feeling the stones. You kind of know the direction you want to go in. But if what you're doing isn't going to get you there, then you adjust course, you change course. And Xi Jinping hosted 2 summits for the Belton Road in Beijing. And I should interject.
I attended the second one.
Right, in 2019. The first one was 2017. And in 2019, as you heard when you were there, the tone was kind of more conciliatory. We want to pay more attention to the environment. We want to pay more attention to what our partners need and want. We're listening to you. Please come along with us. It'll be a win-win. I just wanted to interject that we're talking about the Belton Road, and that probably means very little to most people listening. So it's a translation from the Chinese Idailu, which is a belt of land routes and a maritime silk road of sea routes. That's what that refers to. So the Chinese government is building both out, but also part of this project is a polar silk road, building out like the northern sea route in the Arctic and collaborating with Arctic partners. There's a digital Silk Road. There's now a health Silk Road. There's a space Silk Road. So in some ways, the Chinese government has used this as kind of a branding exercise, but it's not just a branding exercise. This is something that has extremely strong support and direction from the highest level. And so in some places, like for instance, in Cambodia, where there's a Chinese state-owned state-owned company concession that takes up 20% of Cambodia's coastline. It's a 99-year lease. The person who shepherded that through was Zheng Gaoli, who at the time was one of the 7 top leaders in China and who headed the Belt and Road, basically policy committee in China. Yeah. So it would be a mistake to say, oh, this is just like a branding exercise and it's just a bunch of things thrown in together. Yes, there are a bunch of things thrown in together, but there's also a very clear vision of where this is supposed to go.
Yeah, when you refer to the ports, for example, and some of the concessions and some of the developments that have occurred, I've also heard of them referred to as string of pearls. Is that, are you familiar with that phrase?
Absolutely. So there's an overlap of 2 things. There's a Chinese military strategy that has been, talked about within China for more than a decade. It was the case when I was still based there up to 2013. And that is to have a string of pearls, of ports that China either manages or partly owns or in some way controls all the way from China to Europe. And the idea is, just strategically, it helps to have a presence all along the way to ensure the security of trade routes, but also possibly for dual use, also possibly for military use should that be needed. So for instance, there is this presence in Cambodia. There's a building out between 2 ports in Malaysia, between Kuantan and Klang. There's Gwadar in Pakistan. A Chinese state-owned enterprise now majority owns Piraeus in Greece.
Yes, I was there when Costco opened that particular project in
Right,
Athens with
right.
some leadership.
And Chinese state-owned companies manage and partly own almost a dozen other ports in Europe. So it's a pretty massive thing. And it's not even just China to Europe. There's a Chinese presence particularly on the east coast of Africa in
Djibouti, yes.
Where China also has a military base, as does the United States.
Right, like 15 miles from each other, or is it 15 kilometers, something along those lines. Yeah. Basically, you can see one from the other.
A Chinese company, a Hong Kong company, Hutchison Whampoa, manages ports on both sides of the Panama Canal, and other Chinese companies. One is building a bridge over the Panama Canal. China was trying to get a new embassy built at the mouth of the Panama Canal where the US military used to be based. So there are a lot of projects that are both strategic and symbolic. In some cases, it almost seems like a deliberate attempt to say, okay, you were here before, now we're here.
Yeah.
I've seen this happen in a few places, Panama being, perhaps one of the most illustrative, given that the US controlled the canal for the better part of the 20th century.
Yeah. Well, there seems to be really this concern that there's this inability, at least from our perspective, to separate military and civilian actions. I mean, that they are in fact intertwined, and so that whenever we see, and that we being either the government or this administration, but also from our industrial base, whenever we look at actions that are taken that are seemingly from a private actor in China, it's very difficult for us to then separate from those actions, those investments, those developments around the world, the goals of the party state, of both the Communist Party and of course the PRC in general. Is that a fair way for us to analyze what's going on as China spreads out, as it develops its BRI, its Belton Road initiative?
I think it's fair. I think it's particularly fair since Xi Jinping in recent weeks has been saying that there's a new push for military-civil fusion in China, for the military and civilians to work more closely together, for state-owned enterprises and the private sector to work more closely together, that there's one China dream, and it's for China to be great in the world, and all Chinese should get behind that dream. And
that China dream is now enshrined within the Constitution, isn't that right?
Well, the Belton Road initiative is enshrined within the Constitution, yes. Now, that said, I lived in China for 15 years, and it's not like all Chinese march in lockstep with Xi Jinping and with the Communist Party. Far from it. But there has been a clampdown on the extent to which speech was allowed, to which criticism was allowed, particularly online in China. There are much harsher penalties now for people who step across the line, and it's never really clear where the line is in terms of criticizing the government or criticizing government policies. So while not all Chinese business people, private business people, are necessarily working with the Chinese military or are totally buying into the Belton Road as this great China dream and military China fusion and all that, they're under pressure if they're of a particular size and a particular level of impact in terms of their economic heft, and particularly for tech companies in China. They're under a lot of pressure from the government to play ball, to, if their tech companies share their data, if they're construction companies and they want to, get work to outside of China, that they need to do the sorts of projects that the Chinese government thinks are important to China's interests.
Right. Well, so, I used to live in the Soviet Union, also back then, a repressive, authoritarian, some would say totalitarian state, although when I was there, it was really sort of falling much more into the authoritarian framework. And there was a fair amount of popular subversion and ability to corruptly get around what the interests of the state were and the ability to be controlled by the state, although obviously many people suffered in that country as well. But that was a while back. And one of the developments in our digitization era is that now you have the ability to, in fact, have a digital authoritarianism, which really can control individuals, movement, investment, money movement, everything to a fairly fine degree. And I know you talk about this as well in your Belton Road podcast when you talk about the minorities in Xinjiang province, the Uyghurs. But it seems to me we're talking about a whole new game once you're able to refine the control capacity of the state in the way that digital technologies allow.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, you start with something as basic as the app WeChat, which is, like several of our apps combined. So people use it to communicate with each other, to send texts, to do video chats. They use it for purchases. They use it to get a taxi, their version of Uber. Medical records are on it. So there's a huge amount of data for each person on that one app. And the Chinese government actually helped shepherd that app through in 2012. It kind of chose it as an app that it wanted to see succeed. And then very quickly, a lot of pressure built for everyone to get that app. I mean, when I left China in 2013 and I went back to visit at least once a year afterward. And I remember by 2014, 2015, it was like, why don't you have WeChat? You should have WeChat. And it was like, because I don't want the government to know who I'm getting in touch with or where I'm going or what I'm buying. And a lot of my Chinese friends and acquaintances would be like, what are you worried about? I'm not doing anything wrong. Are you doing anything wrong?
Right.
So, I mean, that is also kind of an enabling environment that people feel like there's so much convenience here with WeChat. Everyone has WeChat, so we should just use it. And nothing's going to happen to you if you're not doing anything wrong until it does. On top of that, the Chinese government's been very rapidly developing AI, artificial intelligence, surveillance technology, and it's been trying it out in Xinjiang very effectively. So, Uyghurs and Kazakhs, ethnic Kazakhs in Xinjiang, hundreds of thousands of whom have been put in detention over the course of the past 3 years. Some estimates are more than 1 million. Those who are outside of the detention camps are still being very closely surveilled through apps, through cameras everywhere, through this whole system of, basically trying to get as much into the intimate lives and even thoughts of people as possible. That system is not used in most of China, but there is something else that's being tried out in certain locales, sort of a pilot projects, which is called the social credit system.
Yeah.
And it's basically giving people points for, like, okay, you ran a red light, you get docked points, you volunteer, you get points, you're hanging out with the wrong person, you get docked points, you said something bad about the government, you get docked points, and suddenly you can't get a plane ticket anymore.
Right.
Or maybe you have a hard time getting a loan for a house or a job. So while this is not yet ubiquitous in China, it's an idea that's been around for a few years and has been tried out in different parts of China.
Yeah.
The implications are kind of chilling.
Yeah. Have in your time there and with those who have been subject to the social credit system, have you sensed any public pushback on this project?
So the social credit system started becoming a thing maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So I was just visiting China at that point. And I would say that as recently as 3 years ago, 2 years ago, because also I was teaching at Berkeley and I had Chinese students, and I'd ask them about, the social credit system, and it surprised me a lot. People hadn't heard about it, didn't think it was real.
Right. It's just like Facebook. Uh, you know, it's funny you mentioned WeChat. My kids, as you know, are Mandarin speakers, and they spend a fair amount of time in China, in the rural part as well as in some of the urban districts. And when the United States banned WeChat in the United States, I asked them if they were going to go on VPNs and try to actually end run the United States, and they said, "Are you crazy?" You know, that's what they do in China. They use VPN to get around to virtual networks.
Yeah, I
To
had one.
You do, yeah, and anyone who really is trying to get news and information from the West and to be able to get on Google or to be able to check their Gmail and do any number of other things really does need to use VPN services to be able to end run the Great Firewall of China. But anyway, are you end running the American blocking of WeChat in any way?
No, I don't use WeChat. I had a VPN when I was in China, but interestingly, the government would show us from time to time that it had the ability to squeeze our VPNs, that it was kind of letting us have our VPNs, you know, foreign business people, to some extent, foreign journalists. But when there was a sensitive event, like, you know, the National People's Congress or the anniversary of the June 4th, you know, Tiananmen crackdown, suddenly your VPN wouldn't work anymore and your internet slowed. And you know, all sorts of other things happened. Like if there was a report on CNN or the BBC that was about any of these things and that was critical of the government in any way, the screen would just go black.
Right.
But those were in the olden days. That was like the way that they tried to censor then. They've become much more sophisticated since then.
Yeah, and in ways that just don't seem as ham-handed. It just sort of becomes ubiquitous and part of the environment, so that you can't really trace it back to the direct hand of the state. You know, MaryKay, I'd like to talk more about the Belton Road stuff, but I also want to talk a bit about some of the strategic things that we've seen happening coming out of China. And I think the two things that are most of interest for an American audience will probably also be a part of our presidential debate if they decide in the debates to discuss foreign policy at all. And I think you know where I'm going. Yeah, or discuss anything for that matter, yes. But nonetheless, the characters of these individuals, of our candidates, are being revealed in these debates, and regardless of where you fall on them. But it's basically Hong Kong and Taiwan is where I'm going with this question. You know, we've seen an awful lot of activity regarding Hong Kong, and then secondarily, I'll want to talk about Taiwan and the potential for conflict there, and what sort of the future looks like. So I'm asking you to sort of take a step above the Belton Road actions here and look at and maybe a bit predictive to look at what it is that's happening and going to happen in both Hong Kong and Taiwan.
Well, what is happening in Hong Kong is shocking. You know, for me, having lived in Hong Kong in the mid-90s, covered the handover. I'd been back many times since the handover to report and to visit. And, I think in the immediate aftermath of the handover in 1997 from British to Chinese rule, the Chinese government promised 50 years of one country, two systems, where Hong Kong could keep its own way of life, its own separate court system, its own civil rights. So, Human Rights Watch has had an office in Hong Kong for years. Han Dongfang, who was one of the Tiananmen protesters who started the China Labor Bulletin, is in Hong Kong. There are a lot of people like that in Hong Kong, and that had always been the case. And it was interesting over those years that I think a lot of people were waiting for the other shoe to drop in the late 90s and early 2000s. And when it didn't, I think a generation grew up thinking, this is the way it is here. We have this separate space, and we increasingly have our own Hong Kong identity that is in opposition in some ways to the mainland Chinese identity, because we have civil rights and they don't. And that created tension between the two, between mainland China and Hong Kong. At the same time, there was a slow, steady squeeze of those civil rights. And so this younger generation started getting very active and then more active and more aggressive, and then Xi Jinping being who he is, who very specifically compared to previous leaders really couldn't handle people challenging him. It's like, okay, well, we got to shut this down. So when there were the big protests last year, which I was at, and in fact, I included a scene from the protests in my first episode of the podcast.
Yeah,
I was there on the day that they first used rubber bullets.
Yeah,
in fact.
It's a very dramatic moment, actually, in your piece, because you really were just walking around in what may have been somewhat of a festive environment, and then, of course, it turns rather ugly.
Yeah. So then, I mean, a lot of people I talked to and have talked to in the last couple of years in Hong Kong just felt like, well, we don't know what difference we can make, but as long as we have a chance to speak our minds, we want to do that. We're going to go down swinging. I think the younger generation of protesters who were starting to talk about independence were always kind of pushing in a direction that seemed unlikely, because Hong Kong gets its drinking water from China.
Yeah.
And, the world has recognized the People's Republic of China's sovereignty over Hong Kong.
Right.
And so it was really kind of like, what kind of a space can you carve for yourself? Can you hold the Chinese government to account for breaking its promise, for not keeping its end of the deal? And, possibly shaming the government in the face of the world, where the Chinese government is trying to build out the Belton Road, and say, hey, trust us, it'll be a win-win. Right. So what's going to happen in Hong Kong? I can't see into the future, but what I can see is that as long as there's an active resistance that keeps pushing against this national security law and against Chinese control, Xi Jinping's instinct is to push back hard and to just squelch it.
Right.
And I think eventually Hong Kong people will figure out that there's still some space, the same way that there's still some space in China, that people find ways to express discontent and criticism, and sometimes it's through coded language, and sometimes it's, in ways other than what they've been used to doing, being out on the street protesting, but even sometimes being out on the street protesting. So I kind of expect, in fact, I do expect that they'll figure it out, but that it's going to be a very different place than it has been. That said, Hong Kong has never been a democracy. It was a colony, a British colony, and then it went over to Chinese rule. And yes, the Chinese government had said, we'll allow you to keep your way of life, but they never actually promised democracy.
Right.
They said, maybe we'll have an election. I talked to someone who was on the Basic Law Committee, the committee that made up the mini constitution for Hong Kong in the early 2000s, like 2003, 2004. And he said, yeah, we were going to have an election by 2007, but we thought by then Hong Kong people would really appreciate the Communist Party leadership, and they don't yet. So they're not ready for an election yet.
Right.
So that's Hong Kong. Taiwan, very briefly.
Let me, and before you do that, I just want to let everybody know, right down here, there's a Q&A button. If you want to ask some questions, I see a couple already have popped up. I'll review them, and then I'll try to incorporate them into this. And as you say, MaryKay, Hong Kong was not a democracy, but it did have a fair number of civil liberties that were different than on the mainland. Okay, Taiwan, are we going to invade? What's going to happen? Clearly, PRC has gotten back Macau. It's gotten back Hong Kong. What remains is Taiwan. What are they going to do?
So Taiwan is a democracy and has been a fully functioning democracy since 1996. I covered that presidential election. The Chinese government was very unhappy with it. They actually lobbed missiles over the Taiwan Straits. The US sent in a couple of aircraft carriers. Both sides stood down, and Taiwan has carried on. Xi Jinping.
That was 24 years ago, before Xi Jinping and before the real significant rise of this country, of China.
Yeah.
So, 2020.
And the majority of Taiwanese would like the status quo. You know, they don't necessarily think that Taiwan should formally declare independence, because that would just trigger the People's Republic of China to attack, invade, whatever. The PRC has been building up its military steadily over the course of the entire time I've been covering China, like since the mid-90s. It's like double-digit growth in the amount of money given to the military every year. But it's an open question whether they're at the point where they know that they could best the US if the two came into conflict over Taiwan. So then there's the question of, if China were to act, is it likely the US would also act? And they're, I think, trying to game that out. Like, what could we do where it would just be below the threshold where the US would feel that it needed to respond? And when would be a good time to do that? When the US is maybe distracted. But so this, in September, there had been some Chinese military flights that crossed the line into Taiwanese airspace. And there had been some speculation among China hands who look at security issues that maybe the Chinese were trying to provoke the Taiwanese into firing the first shot. Of course, they didn't. So that, you know, the Taiwanese have kind of learned to manage China and Chinese aggression and Chinese insistence that Taiwan is part of China and Taiwan needs to come on board. And they'll keep doing that as long as they can. Right. Whether Xi Jinping ends up deciding, no, now's the time, we're going to do it, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't put money on the likelihood of that happening in the immediate future, but a lot of things happen that surprise you, so who knows?
Yeah, you know, and one of the things that does surprise me, and maybe surprises me less, is the approach that the PRC has used and the Communist Party has used has been this, to quote one of the former leaders, a hide and bide strategy, which is really just saying, look, take your time. Things are going to go your way. Economically, we're going to become stronger. We're going to be able to build out the networks and the infrastructure we need to build out in our military. There's really no need to be impatient. That seems to have flipped on its head with Xi Jinping, and it seems that there's nothing but impatience with him, making sure that he can stay in power as long as he needs, making sure that he's consolidating that power within his own country, and so that's the qualitative difference that I've seen in the leadership style, and in particular in the leadership of Xi Jinping.
I think that's right. That Xi Jinping thinks, yeah, hide and bide. I mean, that's so last decade. I mean, it's time for China to, throw off the cloak of invisibility and be what it can be in the world. And I think there's another component to that, which is that, you know, China's population is aging, its economy is slowing, it's more mature than it was. Right now, China has the resources that it can leverage into doing something like the Belton Road initiative. And I think, you know, like many empires in the past have spread out and have tried to use resources from other places to feed the core, to feed the country that's in charge of the empire. The Chinese government is doing its version of that without colonizing anyone. It's saying, you know, come on board, this will be great for everyone. And in some cases, it really has helped otherwise impoverished economies, like in Cambodia and in Ethiopia. But there's also a price to pay, you know, in terms of possibly, in the case of Cambodia, in Sihanoukville, which is Cambodia's port city, last year when I visited, Cambodians there were complaining bitterly about how the place was, I mean, basically there were more Chinese living there than Cambodians. And, right. And it no longer felt like a Cambodian town. It was one big Chinese construction site with dozens of casinos. And then, you know, Hun Sen, the prime minister in Cambodia, recognized that this level of anger was maybe not good for him. And he ended up banning online casinos. And the government says, the Cambodian government says that in early this year, 400,000 Chinese left Cambodia. Wow. Some of them may have come back, but that gives you an idea, since, I mean, the population of Cambodia is just like, I think it's between 10 and 12 million right now. That's a pretty significant number of people to come into your country. And there's this feeling of, wait, what happened to our sovereignty?
Yeah. So let me ask you an economic question because we've got a couple of cues here. One's, and they're related to what you were just talking about in terms of investment and the BRI and secondarily and how it relates to the military. One question from Herb Marsh is, how can China afford their huge expenditures for Belt and Road and their military buildup? Is it true they are sitting on a $4 trillion reserve? And there's a second question from Mark S., who says, how aware is the CPC that its military buildup and capability hinges on its global economic footprint? Does that temper its boldly communist and even aggressive rhetoric for fear of losing business in its BRI goals? Or does that even factor into the mindset of the Communist Party? So those are related, and you'll tie them together.
Yeah, well, I think the BRI has a lot of dual use projects. We talked about the ports. Some of it is about, the Chinese government wanting to make sure that its need to get resources from different parts of the world will be met. That it's making the deals with different countries where it's getting minerals, it's getting soy, it's getting various resources that the Chinese population need. But there's a bigger aspiration for China to have a blue water navy, to have a presence well beyond, what could be considered China's backyard in Southeast Asia, the first island chain, as it's sometimes called. And that's both to protect China from attack, but it's also to project Chinese power. The first question again was?
It was about the $4 trillion reserve. It's spending all this money, right, to do the BRI, as you say, 600 billion at this point is what you're estimating at. But he asked if there was a $4 trillion reserve that they're sitting on that they can do a great number with. But you also talked about military expenditures and growth in the military budget. How can it do both these things?
So a lot of the money that's going out, these are loans. Right, so China expects to get the money back. It's certainly using, some of the money that it's built up over the course of 20, 30 years of being the world's factory to finance this. But within China, there has been some concern about how, maybe we're overextending ourselves. You get to the old saying about how if someone owes you or if you owe the bank, $100,000 or $1,000, it's your problem. If you owe the bank, $10 million, it's the bank's problem. And in the case of the Belton Road initiative projects, there's always this issue of, okay, in Sri Lanka, the Chinese government was able to get, and Chinese state-owned enterprises were able to get a deal that works in China's interests. But what if another place said, yeah, we're not going to give you anything? I mean, what's the Chinese government going to do? Invade?
Right.
And, what's the cost for doing that?
Yeah.
So there actually has been a recalibration within China. Belton Road initiative investments kind of peaked in 2015, 2016. The project's still very much alive. And by project, I mean writ large, the initiative is still very much alive. But they're more carefully looking at projects. There are fewer boondoggles. There are fewer projects that don't really make sense where, maybe it's more money than the government really wants to lay out. And in some cases, it's worth laying out the money as a loan and sometimes even as a grant because there's something else at stake. It's a strategic relationship that's at stake and that's worth investing in.
Yeah.
But in other cases where the state-owned enterprise or the policy bank that's pursuing this is seeing this both as a strategic investment and as a business deal. They're looking for a return. They want to make sure that they get their money back.
Yeah, well, it'll raise the question, especially as China tries to become more active in some of these international bodies like the United Nations. The debate is oftentimes how do you then forgive debt to those nations that are developing that are unable to make good on their loans. So I imagine
so the government's not forgiving debt that much, but in the wake of COVID, it's gone along with the G20 and saying we'll give like basically a two-year holiday on repayments.
Right. So some
But the Chinese
restructuring.
government wasn't the first to come forward and say we'll do that. They were slow to say that.
Yeah. Well, maybe their role within these international bodies will force them to become much more responsible and maybe even take the lead. As you said earlier, they are adaptable and they do react to if not popular sentiment within their own country, then certainly international pressure, at least at this point. So let me talk about, I couldn't help but imagine if the $400 million that Donald Trump is our problem or a bank's problem, but I'll let the voters decide that when it comes to November. But I do want to talk about the presidential election in the United States and how that's going to affect our policy, the United States policy towards the People's Republic of China. Clearly, Donald Trump sees himself as a hawk in this regard. He's tried to paint Vice President Biden as someone who's been soft on China. How do you see the China card being played in this election, and what are the vulnerabilities for our candidates?
Well, let me preface that by saying, in terms of how the Trump administration has dealt with sanctioning Chinese companies, they haven't been entirely wrong in several cases. Like, TikTok, you could certainly argue about, was that really the app that, is of strategic interest and concern to the United States? But for instance, one of the state-owned companies that's involved in the Belton Road initiative, it's one of the main companies building out infrastructure, China Communications Construction Company. The Trump administration has sanctioned it. So it helped to build the islands in the South China Sea and the military bases on them. It's also building projects in Panama, and it's building projects elsewhere along the Belton Road. So basically, the Trump administration has called it out and said this is clearly a company that is pursuing policies on behalf of the Chinese government that are dual use, and it's a threat to US security interests. There's the Chinese company that got the concession in Cambodia, for 20% of Cambodia's coastline. The Trump administration just used the Magnitsky Authority against that company, the Union Development Group, which was created just to do this project. And as I said, the project was marshaled through by a very senior Chinese leader. Why are they concerned about that? Because if you think about the Cambodian coastline, and then you think about where Thailand is, just north of Cambodia, and then Malaysia's on the other side of kind of a U, having that presence there, and it's right across from where, if this ever happens, and it may not, Thailand's considering building a canal itself, which would make it a lot quicker to get to the Indian Ocean from the South China Sea. It would also be possible for a Chinese military presence to curtain off mainland Southeast Asia from US ships. Now, some military analysts I've talked to have said, well, the US is pretty good at, kind of outmaneuvering this sort of thing at the moment, but it's a concern. Yeah. So, just to say, there have been moves against certain companies and certain things that China's been pursuing on the Belton Road and in tech on the digital Silk Road that maybe needed some attention. But in terms of the general relationship with China, I think Xi Jinping has kind of been waiting Trump out because on the one hand, in China, the discussion is, well, maybe it's good for us that this is costing the US its international reputation, and we look good by comparison. But he's so unpredictable that it's not the relationship we had before. We don't really know how to work this. Yeah. And so in some ways, I think a President Biden would both be a relief in that he would go back to more predictable behavior, probably working multilaterally with Western allies and Japan, but at least China knows that game. The Chinese leadership knows that game. On the other hand, it could actually have an effect on, sort of comparatively speaking, how China and the US are seen again in the world, particularly if a President Biden decided to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership in Southeast Asia, and also including Japan and some Latin American countries and Canada. That, and this was an initiative that the Obama administration started precisely to have a counterbalance to China economically, but also in terms of kind of soft power in the region. So, and you had asked specifically how the China card is being played in the campaign, and I'm answering a slightly different question, which is what might we expect from either administration after the election, and how is China seeing it?
Yeah, and well, I think that's great, MaryKay, because it really is the one insight that we don't generally have in the United States is how is China perceiving this election and how are they likely to react. I think what you're finding also in the electorate is that there's been a general consensus, both in the electorate and also within our legislature, that that getting tougher on China from how we've had our relationship in the past, moving beyond just engagement, into a much more robust reaction to some of the activities, whether they be military or some of the dual use investments that are being made around the world, that there is this appetite within the United States politically to in fact be more if not confrontational, certainly much more aware and a little tougher in terms of how that relationship should evolve and how that trade relationship should develop. We are getting near the end of this, and there are a few questions here. I know that some of these questions will get answered on your podcast because I've listened to a number of the editions that you've done, and they really are quite thorough and they give us great insight. But you'll see, I'll just go through some of these quick questions. And one person asks about comparing the rise of China to America's development when it took over global leadership from Britain, for example. Questions on whether or not China will inevitably invade Taiwan. And finally, how China's initiative and its interest in asserting its sovereignty over the internet. Of course, it makes us think about Huawei and some of the dominance within the 5G network space. What are the implications of that in global internet governance? As I say, a lot of this will be borne out within your own reporting that you can hear, but I'd like for you to let our viewers and listeners hear how they can get to your podcast.
Sure. Well, wherever you get your podcasts, as the saying goes, but also you can go to the globalreportingcenter.org, and there you'll find not just the podcast, but photos and transcripts. And also the podcast is being excerpted on PRX's The World every Monday. And I also have essays on The World's website that accompany each episode as they roll out.
Great. And so could you say a bit more about your partners on this? It's not just this one single project that they're working on. They're actually busy and interested in doing other types of reporting around the world.
Right. So the Global Reporting Center was started by Peter Klein, who's a former 60 Minutes producer. And it's based at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, but works with journalists all over the world and basically encourages, in-depth reporting on important global issues that are perhaps undercovered. And one of the things the Global Reporting Center really stresses is the importance of journalists working as partners with journalists who are in the countries that they're reporting on, rather than using them as fixers. That, we work as colleagues, and, we're not the, white Americans coming in and saying, okay, I've been here for 3 days, now I can say what's going on here. You approach a story with humility and with an open mind, and you work with people who know a lot more than you do about the subject, and hopefully, working together, you're able to tell a story that helps Americans better understand parts of the world. Well,
MaryKay, thank you so much for your participation today. We're glad you could join us and talk about this incredibly important issue. I'm sure our listeners and viewers will go to your podcast website to be able to download it and hear the really extraordinary reporting and colorful and really rich in sound reporting and production that you've put together. To those of you who've joined us today, thank you. We hope you enjoyed today's program. Please join World Affairs next week for 2 programs. The first will be on Tuesday, October 6th, on the next generation of voters and youth activism. We're featuring 4 incredible youth activists who are dedicated to making the world, their future, and a better and more equitable place. And on Thursday, October the 8th, we're hosting political satirist and author P.J. O'Rourke, someone whom I've read for years. I'm sure it'll be an engaging, amusing program on his observations on the state of affairs in the United States. Make sure to RSVP on our website. Have a great rest of your week, and thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, MaryKay.
Thank you.